Chapter 22 of Susan B. Anthony by Alma Lutz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, Victories in the West. New western states were coming into the Union, North and South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming, and in Susan's opinion, it was highly important that they be admitted as women's suffrage states, for she had not forgotten that disturbing line of the Supreme Court decision in the Virginia minor case which read, "No new state has ever been admitted to the Union which has conferred the right of suffrage on women, and this has never been considered a valid objection to her admission." Susan wanted to start a new trend. Opposition to Wyoming's women's suffrage provision was strong in Congress, in spite of the fact that it had the unanimous approval of Wyoming's Constitutional Convention. To Susan, in the gallery of the House of Representatives, listening anxiously to the debate on the admission of Wyoming, defeat was unthinkable after women had voted in the territory of Wyoming for 20 years. But Democrats, wishing to block the admission of a preponderantly Republican state, used women's suffrage as an excuse. With a sinking heart, she heard an amendment offered, limiting suffrage in Wyoming to males. At the crucial moment, however, the tide was turned by a telegram from the Wyoming legislature, the words of which rejoiced Susan. "We will remain out of the Union 100 years rather than come in without women's suffrage." After this, the House voted to admit Wyoming 139 to 127, but the Senate delayed, renewing the attack on the women's suffrage provision. Not until July 1890, while she was speaking to a large audience in the Opera House at Madison, South Dakota, did the good news of the admission of Wyoming reach her. Jubilant as she commented on this great victory, she spoke as one inspired, for she saw this as the turning point in her 40 long years of uphill work. Neither North Dakota nor South Dakota had wanted to risk their chances of statehood by incorporating women's suffrage in their constitutions. Yet public opinion in both states was friendly, South Dakota directing its first legislature to submit the question to the voters. It was this that brought Susan to South Dakota in 1890. Sentiment for women's suffrage in South Dakota had previously been created almost entirely by the WCTU, and this had linked women's suffrage and prohibition together. Now, the liquor interests made prohibition an issue in this women's suffrage campaign, as they rallied their forces for the repeal of prohibition which had been adopted when South Dakota was admitted to statehood. Through the propaganda of the liquor interests, the 30,000 foreign-born voters became formidable opponents, and newly naturalized Russians, Scandinavians, and Poles, given the vote before American women, wore badges carrying the slogan, "Against Women's Suffrage and Susan B. Anthony." Both Republicans and Democrats cultivated these foreign-born voters, turning a cold shoulder to the women's suffrage amendment and refusing to endorse it in their state conventions. Even the Farmers' Alliance and the Knights of Labor, previously friendly to women's suffrage, now joined with the prohibitionists to form a third political party which also failed to endorse the women's suffrage amendment. On top of all this, anti-suffragists from Massachusetts, calling themselves remonstrants, flooded South Dakota with their leaflets. It now seemed to Susan as if every clever politician had lined up against women. During these trying days, Anna Howard Shaw joined her, and together they covered the state, hoping by the truth and sincerity of their statements to quash the propaganda against women's suffrage. Often they traveled in freight cars, as transportation was limited, or drove long distances in wagons over the sun-baked prairie. The heat was intense, and the hot winds, blowing incessantly, seared everything they touched. After 2 years of drought, the farmers were desperately poor, and Susan, concerned over their plight, wondered why Congress could not have appropriated the money for artesian wells to help these honest, earnest people, instead of voting $40,000 for an investigating commission. Occasionally, Susan and Anna spent the night in isolated sod houses where ingenious pioneer women cooked their scant meals over burning chips of buffalo bones gathered on the prairie. Glorying in the valiant spirit of these women, who in loneliness and hardship played an important but unheralded role in the conquest of this new country, Susan was generous with her praise. To them, her words of commendation were like a benediction, and few of them ever forgot a visit from Susan B. Anthony. By this time, life on the frontier was an old story to her, for she had campaigned under similar conditions in Kansas and in the far West. Nonetheless, the hardships were trying. Yet this plucky woman of 70 wrote friends in the East, "Tell everybody that I am perfectly well in body and in mind, never better, and never doing more work. Oh, the lack of modern comforts and conveniences! But I can put up with it better than any of the young folks. I shall push ahead and do my level best to carry this state, come weal or woe to me personally. I never felt so buoyed up with the love and sympathy and confidence of the good people everywhere." Young, vigorous Anna Howard Shaw proved to be a campaigner after Susan's own heart, tireless, uncomplaining, and good-tempered, an exceptional speaker, witty and quick to say the right word at the right time. It was a joy to find in Anna the same devotion to the cause that she herself felt, the same crusading fervor and reliability. During the long drives over the prairie, she talked to Anna of the work that must be done, of what it would mean to the woman of the future, and she fired Anna's soul with the flame that burned in her own. Another young Western woman, Carrie Chapman Catt, also attracted Susan's attention at this time. She had volunteered for the South Dakota campaign after attending her first National Women's Suffrage Convention, and Susan, meeting her in Huron, South Dakota, to map out a speaking tour for her, found a tall, handsome, confident young woman ready to attack the work and see it through, in spite of the hardships which confronted her. Carrie Lane, a graduate of Iowa State College, had briefly studied law and taught school before her marriage to Lee Chapman. Now, 4 years after his death, she had married George W. Catt of Seattle, a promising young engineer and a former fellow student at Iowa State College. What particularly impressed Susan was that Carrie, in spite of her marriage in June, had kept her pledge to come to South Dakota. She was pleased with the way Carrie not only heroically filled every difficult engagement, but sized up the campaign for herself and planned for the future. In Carrie's report of her work, there was a ruthless practicality which was rare, and which instantly won Susan's approval. Here was a young woman to watch and to keep in the work. The visible result of 6 months of campaigning was defeat, with the vote 22,972 for women's suffrage and 45,632 opposed. And as Susan remembered the maneuvers of the politicians, the trading of votes for the location of the state capital, and the scheming of the liquor interests, she felt she was championing a lonely cause. From now on, Susan hoped to turn over to the younger women much of the lecturing and organizing in the West, and she needed an anchorage, a home of her own from which she could direct her work. Her mother had willed 17 Madison Street to Mary, who had rented the first floor and was living on the second, where there was a room for Susan. Now that Susan planned to spend more time at home, and Mary had retired from teaching, they decided to take over the whole house, modernize and redecorate it, and enjoy it the rest of their lives. Mary, as usual, took charge, but Susan had definite ideas about what should be done. Mary, who had learned to be cautious and frugal, was more willing than Susan to make old furnishings do, but their friends came to the rescue, showering them with gifts. Freshly painted and papered, with new rugs on the floor, lace curtains at the windows, easy chairs and new furniture here and there, the house was all Susan had wished for, and everywhere were familiar touches, such as her mother's spinning wheel by the fireplace in the back parlor. She spent most of her time in her study on the second floor. Here she hung her pictures of the reformers she admired and loved, and right over her desk, looking down at her, was the comforting picture of her dearest friend, Mrs. Stanton. Hour after hour she sat at this desk, writing letters, hurriedly dashing off one after another, writing just as the thoughts came, as if she were talking, bothering little with punctuation, using dashes instead, and vigorously underlining words and phrases for emphasis. Instructions to workers in all parts of the country, letters of friendship and sympathy, answers to the many questions which came in every mail, these were signed and sealed, one after another, and slipped into the mailbox when she took a brisk walk before going to bed. She started each day with the morning newspaper, stepping out on the front veranda to pick it up, taking a deep breath of fresh air, and enjoying the green grass and the tall, graceful chestnut trees in front of the house. Then sitting down in the back parlor, beside the big table covered with magazines and mail, she carefully read her paper before beginning the work at her desk, for she must keep up to date on the news. Rochester was important to her. It was her city, and she was on hand with her colleagues whenever there was an opportunity for women to express interest in its government, progress, or welfare. Not only did she encourage women to make use of their newly won right to vote in school elections, she also urged municipal suffrage for women, appealing to the governor to appoint a woman to fill a vacancy on the Board of Trustees of Rochester's State Industrial School. She herself received the appointment, which the Democrat and Chronicle called a fitting recognition of one of the ablest and best women in the Commonwealth. One of her first acts as trustee was a practical one for the girls. Spent entire day at State Industrial School, she wrote in her diary, getting the laundry girls, who had always washed for the entire institution by hand and ironed that old way, transferred to the boys' laundry room to use its machinery. I'm sure it will work well. Girls, 12 of them, delighted. She also taught the boys to patch and darn, and later asked for coeducation. Susan looked forward to welcoming Mrs. Stanton at 17 Madison Street when she returned to this country in 1891, particularly because she had sold her home in Tenafly after her husband's death in 1887, and now had no home to go to. Susan hoped that as they again worked together, she could persuade Mrs. Stanton to concentrate on more serious writing than the chatty reminiscences she had just published and which Susan felt were not the greatest of herself. When she heard that Mrs. Stanton seriously contemplated living in New York with 2 of her children, she begged her to reconsider, writing, "This is the first time since 1850 that I have anchored myself to any particular spot, and in doing it my constant thought was that you would come here, and stay for as long, at least, as we must be together to put your writings into systematic shape to go down to posterity. I have no writings to go down, so my ambition is not for myself, but is for the one by the side of whom I have wrought these 40 years, and to get whose speeches before audiences has been the delight of my life." Mrs. Stanton decided to make her home in New York, but first she visited Susan, who found her as stimulating as ever and brimful of ideas. They plotted and planned as of old, and managed to stir up public opinion on the question of admitting women to the University of Rochester. With women enrolled at the University of Michigan since 1870, and at Cornell since 1872, and with Columbia University yielding at last to women's entreaties by establishing Barnard College in 1889, they felt it their duty to awaken Rochester, and although their agitation produced no immediate results, it did start other women thinking, and made news for the press. The cartoons on the subject delighted them both. Susan soon realized that the writing she had planned for Mrs. Stanton would never be done, for Mrs. Stanton had already made up her mind to write for magazines and newspapers on new and controversial subjects, feeling this was the best contribution she could make to the cause. Susan also found it increasingly difficult to hold her old friend to the straight path of women's suffrage, Mrs. Stanton insisting that too much concentration on this one subject was narrowing and left women unprepared for the intelligent use of the ballot. Women, Mrs. Stanton argued, needed to be stirred up to think, and this they would not do as long as their minds were dominated by the Church, which she believed had for generations hampered their development by emphasizing their inferiority and subordination. She was determined to analyze and rebel, and Susan could in no way divert her. Completely absorbed in trying to prove that the Bible, accurately translated and interpreted, did not teach the inferiority or the subordination of women, she was writing a book which she called the Woman's Bible, chapters of which were already appearing in the Woman's Tribune. Susan was not unsympathetic to Mrs. Stanton's ideas, but she opposed this excursion into religious controversy because she was sure it would stir up futile wrangles among the suffragists and keep Mrs. Stanton from giving her best to the cause. Her lack of interest then, and her frank disapproval as the Woman's Bible progressed, were a great disappointment to Mrs. Stanton, and these 2 old friends began to grow somewhat apart as they took different roads to reach their goal, the one intent on freeing women's minds, the other determined to establish their citizenship. Yet their friendship endured. In 1892, Susan reluctantly consented to Mrs. Stanton's retirement as president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Mrs. Stanton's request that she be followed by Susan won unanimous approval, and Anna Howard Shaw was moved up to second place, vice president at large. For 40 years, Susan had watched Mrs. Stanton preside with a poise, warmth, and skill which few could equal. She knew she would miss her dynamic, reassuring presence at the conventions. Yet she was obliged to admit to herself that it was more than fitting that she should at last head the ever-growing organization which she had built up. This was the last convention which Mrs. Stanton attended, and it was the last for Lucy Stone, who died the next year. Susan appreciated the eager young women who now took their places but she did not yet feel completely at home with them. "Only think," she wrote an old-time colleague, "I shall not have a white-haired woman on the platform with me, and I shall be alone there of all the pioneer workers. Always with the old guard, I had perfect confidence that the wise and right thing would be said. What a platform ours then was of self-reliant, strong women. I felt sure of you all. I cannot feel quite certain that our younger sisters will be equal to the emergency. Yet they are each and all valiant, earnest, and talented, and will soon be left to manage the ship without even me." In 1892, the year of the presidential election, Susan hopefully attended the national political conventions. Again the Republicans made their proverbial excuses, explaining that they not only faced a formidable opponent in Grover Cleveland, but also the threat of a new People's Party. The familiar ring of their alibis, which they had repeated since Reconstruction days, made Susan wonder when, and if ever, the Republicans would feel able to bear the strain of women's suffrage. Their platform remembered the poor, the foreign-born, and male Negroes, but it still ignored women. Yet hope for the future stirred in her heart, as she saw at the convention 2 women serving as delegates from Wyoming. Here was the entering wedge. The Democrats, as usual, were silent on women's suffrage, but undismayed by them, or by the prohibitionists, who this year failed to endorse votes for women, Susan moved on to Omaha with Anna Howard Shaw for the first national convention of the new People's Party. Here she met representatives of the Farmers' Alliance and the Knights of Labor, both friendly to women's suffrage, and men from other groups critical of the 2 major political parties for their failure to solve the pressing economic problems confronting the nation. Susan was sympathetic with many of the aims of the People's Party, having seen with her own eyes the plight of debt-burdened, hard-working farmers, and having crusaded in her own paper, The Revolution, for the rights of labor and for the control of industrial monopoly. However, she still viewed minor reform parties with a highly critical eye. The People's Party gave her no women's suffrage plank, and she found them quite as obvious to the underlying principle of justice to women as either of the old parties. With the election of Grover Cleveland, whose opposition to women's suffrage was well known, and with the Democrats in the saddle for another 4 years, congressional action on the women's suffrage amendment was blocked. Nevertheless, the cause moved ahead in the states. Colorado was to vote on the question in 1893, and Kansas in 1894, and New York was revising its constitution. In addition, the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893 offered endless opportunities to bring the subject before the people. As soon as plans for the World's Fair were underway, Susan began to work indirectly through prominent women in Washington and Chicago for the appointment of women to the Board of Management. Lady managers were appointed, 115 strong, who proved to be very much alive under the leadership of Mrs. Bertha Honoré Palmer. Susan found Mrs. Palmer almost as determined as she to secure equality of rights for women at the World's Fair, and nothing that she herself might have planned could have been more effective than the series of World Congresses in which both men and women took part, or than the World's Congress of Representative Women. 2 of Susan's girls, as she liked to call them, Rachel Foster Avery and May Wright Sewell, were appointed by Mrs. Palmer to take charge of the World's Congress of Representative Women, and they arranged a meeting of the International Council of Women as a part of this Congress. Convening soon after the opening of the World's Fair, the Congress of Representative Women drew record crowds at its 81 sessions. 27 countries and 126 organizations were represented. Here Susan, to her joy, heard Negroes, American Indians, and Mormons tell of their progress and their problems, and saw them treated with as much respect as American millionaires, English nobility, or the most virtuous conservative housewife. Watching these women assemble, talking with them, and listening to their well-delivered speeches, she felt richly rewarded for the lonely work she had undertaken 40 years before, when scarcely a woman could be coaxed to a meeting, or be persuaded to express her opinions in public. Although only one session of the Congress was devoted to the civil and political rights of women, it was gratifying to her that women's need of the ballot was spontaneously brought up in meeting after meeting, showing that women, whatever their cause or whatever their organization, were recognizing that only by means of the vote could their reforms be achieved. Speaking on the subject to which she had dedicated her life, Susan gave credit to the pioneering suffragists for the change which had taken place in public opinion regarding the position of women. She urged women's organizations to give suffrage their wholehearted support, and pointed out the great power of some of the newer organizations, such as the WCTU, with its membership of 500,000, and the Young General Federation of Women's Clubs of 40,000 members. Confessing that her own National American Women's Suffrage Association, in comparison, was poor in numbers and limited in funds, she added, "I would philosophize on the reason why. It is because women have been taught always to work for something else than their own personal freedom. And the hardest thing in the world is to organize women for the one purpose of securing their political liberty and political equality." Even so, the vital women's rights organizations, she concluded, drew the whole world to them in spirit, if not in person. Her very presence among them, without her words, in fact her very presence on the fairgrounds, advertised her cause, for in the mind of the public she personified women's suffrage. This tall, dignified woman with smooth gray hair, abundant in energy and spontaneous friendliness, was the center of attraction at the World's Congress of Representative Women. In her new black dress of Chinese silk, brightened with blue, and her small black bonnet, trimmed with lace and blue forget-me-nots, she was the perfect picture of everyone's grandmother, and the people took her to their hearts. She was the one woman all wanted to see. Curious crowds jammed the hall and corridors when she was scheduled to speak, and often a policeman had to clear the way for her. At whatever meeting she appeared, the audience at once burst into applause and started calling for her, interrupting the speakers, and were not satisfied until she had mounted the platform so that all could see her and she had said a few words. Then they cheered her. After years of ridicule and unpopularity, she hardly knew what to make of all this, but she accepted it with happiness as a tribute to her beloved cause. Many who had been critical and wary of her new-fangled notions began to reverse their opinions after they saw her and heard her words of good common sense. Even those who still opposed women's suffrage left the World's Fair with a new respect for Susan B. Anthony. She stayed on in Chicago for much of the summer and fall, for she was in demand as a speaker at several of the World Congresses and had 5 speeches to read for Mrs. Stanton, who felt unable to brave the heat and the crowds. She felt at home in this bustling, rapidly growing city, which for so many years had been the halfway station on her lecture and campaign trips through the West. Here she had always found a warm welcome, first from her cousins, the Dickinsons, then from the ever-widening circle of friends she won for her cause. Now she was literally swamped with hospitality. She rejoiced that such great numbers of everyday people were able to enjoy the beauty of the fairgrounds and the many interesting exhibits. And when a group of clergymen urged Sunday closing, she took issue with them, declaring that Sunday was the only day on which many were free to attend. Asked by a disapproving clergyman if she would like to have a son of hers attend Buffalo Bill's Wild West show on Sunday, she promptly and bluntly replied, "Of course I would, and I think he would learn far more there than from the sermons in some churches." Hearing of this, Buffalo Bill offered her a box at his popular Wild West show, and she appeared the next day with 12 of her girls. Dashing into the arena on his spirited horse while the band played and the spotlight flashed on him, Buffalo Bill rode directly up to Susan's box, reined his horse, and swept off his big Western hat to salute her. Quick to respond, she rose and bowed, and beaming with pleasure, waved her handkerchief at him while the immense audience applauded and cheered. She returned home early in November 1893, with happy memories of the World's Fair and to good news from Colorado. "Telegram from Denver said women's suffrage carried by 5,000 majority," she recorded in her diary. This laconic comment in no way expressed the joy in her heart. Her diaries, written hurriedly in small fine script, year after year, in black-covered notebooks about 3 inches by 6, were a brief, terse record of her work and her travels. Only occasionally a line of philosophizing shone out from the mass of routine detail, or an illuminating comment on a friend or a difficult situation, but she never failed to record a family anniversary, a birthday, or a death. The Colorado victory, referred to so casually in her diary, was actually of great importance to her and her cause, for it carried forward the trend initiated by the admission of Wyoming as a woman's suffrage state in 1890. Colorado also proved to her that her girls could take over her work. So busy had she been winning goodwill for the cause at the World's Fair that she had left Colorado in the capable hands of the women of the state and of young, efficient Carrie Chapman Catt, to whom she now turned over the supervision of all state campaigns. Encouragement also came from another part of the world, from New Zealand, where the vote was extended to women. This confirmed her growing conviction that equal citizenship was best understood on the frontier, and that in her own country victory would come from the West. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Susan B. Anthony by Alma Lutz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Liquor interests alert foreign-born voters against women's suffrage. I am in the midst of as severe a treadmill as I ever experienced, traveling from 50 to 100 miles every day and speaking 5 or 6 nights a week, Susan wrote a friend in 1894, during the campaign to wrest women's suffrage from the New York Constitutional Convention. She was now 74 years old. Political machines and financial interests were deeply entrenched in New York, and although 2 governors had recommended that women be represented in the Constitutional Convention, and a bill had been passed making women eligible as delegates, neither Republicans nor Democrats had the slightest intention of allowing women to slip into men's stronghold. It was obvious to Susan that without representation at the convention and without power to enforce their demands, women's only hope was an intensive educational campaign which she now directed with vigor. Whenever she could, she conferred with Mrs. Stanton, whose judgment she valued, and there was zest in working together as they had during the previous Constitutional Convention in 1867. The women of New York were aroused as never before. Young, able speakers went through the state, piling up signatures on their petitions, but they had few influential friends among the delegates. Anti-suffragists were active, encouraged by Bishop Doane of the Protestant Episcopal Church and Mrs. Lyman Abbott, whose name carried the prestige and influence of her husband's popular magazine, The Outlook. With the election of Joseph Choate of New York as president of the convention, Susan knew that women's suffrage was doomed, for Choate had political aspirations and was not likely to let his sympathies for an unpopular cause jeopardize his chances of becoming governor. While he gave women every opportunity to be heard, at the same time he arranged for the defeat of women's suffrage by appointing men to consider the subject who were definitely opposed, and they submitted an adverse report. Here was a situation similar to that in 1867, when her one-time friend, Horace Greeley, had deserted women for political expediency. "I'm used to defeat every time, and know how to pick up and push on for another attack," she wrote as she now turned her attention to Kansas. The Republicans in Kansas had sponsored school and municipal suffrage for women and had passed a women's suffrage amendment to be referred to the people in 1894. Yet they proved to be as great a disappointment to Susan as they were in 1867, when as a last resort she had been obliged to campaign with the Democrats and George Francis Train. The population of Kansas had changed with the years, as immigrants from Europe had come into the state, and Susan was again confronted with the powerful opposition of foreign-born voters for whose support the political parties bargained. The liquor interests were also active, and the Republicans, who had brought prohibition to Kansas, now left the question discreetly alone, even making a deal with German Democrats for their votes by promising to ignore in their platform both prohibition and women's suffrage. Prohibition and women's suffrage were synonymous in the minds of voters, because women had generally voted for enforcement in municipal elections, and no matter how hard Susan tried, she found it impossible to have women's suffrage considered on its own merits. Watching the straws in the wind, she saw Republican supremacy seriously threatened by the new Populist Party. Convinced that she could no longer count on help from Kansas Republicans, she turned to the Populist Party, ignoring the pleas of Republican women who warned her she would hurt the cause by association with such a radical group. The Populists were generally regarded as the party of social unrest, of a regulated economy and unsound money, and they were looked upon with suspicion. To many, they represented a threat to the American free enterprise system, and they were blamed for the labor troubles which had flared up in the bloody Homestead strike, in the steel mills of Pennsylvania, and in the Pullman strike, defying the powerful railroads. Susan was never afraid to side with the underdog, and she could well understand why Western farmers, in the hope of relief, were eagerly flocking into the Populist Party when their corn sold for 10 cents a bushel and the products they bought were high-priced, and their mortgage interest was never lower than 10%. To the Populist Convention she declared, I have labored for women's enfranchisement for 40 years, and I have always said that for the party that endorsed it, whether Republican, Democratic, or Populist, I would wave my handkerchief." "We want more than the waving of your handkerchief, Miss Anthony," interrupted a delegate, who then asked her, "If the People's Party put a women's suffrage plank in its platform, will you go before the voters of this state and tell them that because the People's Party has espoused the cause of women's suffrage, it deserves the vote of everyone who is a supporter of that cause?" "I most certainly will," she replied, adding as the audience cheered her wildly, "for I would surely choose to ask votes for the party which stood for the principle of justice to women, though wrong on financial theories, rather than for the party which was sound on questions of money and tariff, and silent on the pending amendment to secure political equality to half of the people." "I most certainly will," was the phrase which was remembered and was flashed through the country, and as a result, the Republican press and Susan's Republican friends harshly criticized her for taking her stand with the radicals. Like all political parties, the Populists found it hard to comprehend justice for women, but after a 4-hour debate, the convention endorsed the women's suffrage amendment, absolving, however, members who refused to support it. The rank and file rejoiced as if each and every one of them were heart and soul for the cause. They cheered, they waved their canes, they threw their hats high in the air, and then swarmed around Susan and Anna Shaw to shake their hands and welcome them into the Populist Party. With women's suffrage at last a political issue in Kansas, Susan left the field to her girls. Her homecoming brought reporters to 17 Madison Street for the details about her alignment with the Populist Party. "I didn't go over to the Populists," she told them. "I have been like a drowning man for a long time, waiting for someone to throw a plank in my direction. I didn't step on the whole platform, but just on the women's suffrage plank. Here is a party in power, which is likely to remain in power, and if it will give its endorsement to our movement, we want it." This explanation, however, did not satisfy her critics, and as the Republican press circulated false stories about her enthusiasm for the Populist Party, letters of protest poured in, among them one from Henry Blackwell. To him she replied, "I shall not praise the Republicans of Kansas, or wish or work for their success, when I know by their own confessions to me that the rights of the women of their state have been traded by them in cold blood for the votes of the lager beer foreigners and whiskey Democrats. I never, in my whole 40 years of work, so utterly repudiated any set of politicians as I do those Republicans of Kansas. I never was surer of my position that no self-respecting woman should wish or work for the success of a party that ignores her political rights." The contest in Kansas was close and bitter. Kansas women carried on an able campaign with the help of Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt. When Susan returned to the state in October, she not only found that the Democrats had entered the fight with an anti-suffrage plank, but the Populists had noticeably lost ground since the Pullman strike riots, the court injunction against the strikers, and the arrest of Eugene V. Debs. Again, this prairie state, from which she had hoped so much, refused to extend suffrage to women. Impulsively, she recommended a little Patrick Henryism to the women of Kansas, suggesting that they fold their hands and refuse to help men run the churches, the charities, and the reform movements. California was the next state to demand Susan's attention. A Republican legislature had submitted a women's suffrage amendment to be voted on by the people in 1896, and the women of California asked for her help. She toured the state in the spring of 1895 with Anna Howard Shaw, and everywhere she won friends. The continuous travel and speaking, however, taxed her far more than she realized, and soon after her return to the East, she collapsed. As this news flashed over the wires, letters poured in from her friends, begging her to spare herself. 2 of these letters were especially precious. One, in bold, vigorous script, was from her good comrade, Parker Pillsbury, now 86, who had been an unfailing help during the most difficult years of her career, and whom she probably trusted more completely than any other man. The other, from her dearest friend, Elizabeth Stanton, read, "I never realized how desolate the world would be to me without you, until I heard of your sudden illness. Let me urge you with all the strength I have, and all the love I bear you, to stay at home and rest, and save your precious self." She now realized that rest was imperative for a time, but it troubled her that people thought of her as old and ill, and she wrote Clara Colby never to mention anyone's illness in her Woman's Tribune, adding, "It is so dreadful to get public thought centered on one as ill, as I have had it for the last 2 months." She had no intention of retiring from the field. She knew her own strength, and that her life must be one of action. "I am able to endure the strain of daily traveling and lecturing at over 70, she observed, "mainly because I have always worked and loved work. As machinery in motion lasts longer than when lying idle, so a body and soul in active exercise escapes the corroding rust of physical and mental laziness, which prematurely cuts off the life of so many women." Yet she did slow up a little, refusing an offer from the Slayton Lecture Bureau for a series of lectures at $100 a night, and she engaged a capable secretary, Emma B. Sweet, to help her with her tremendous correspondence. Dear Rachel had given her a typewriter, and now, instead of dashing off letters at her desk late at night, she learned to dictate them to Mrs. Sweet at regular hours. As requests came in from newspapers and magazines for her comments on a wide variety of subjects, she answered those that made possible a word on the advancement of women. Bicycling had come into vogue, and women as well as men were taking it up, some women even riding their bicycles in short skirts or bloomers. What did she think of this? "If women ride the bicycle or climb mountains," she replied, "they should don a costume which will permit them the use of their legs." Of bicycling, she said, "I think it has done more to emancipate women than any one thing in the world. I rejoice every time I see a woman ride by on a wheel. It gives her a feeling of self-reliance and independence the moment she takes her seat, and away she goes, the picture of untrammeled womanhood." Susan returned to California in February 1896. Through the generosity and interest of 2 young Rochester friends, her Unitarian minister, William C. Gannett, and his wife, Mary Gannett, she was able to take her secretary with her. Making her home in San Francisco with her devoted friend, Ellen Sargent, she at once began to plan speaking tours for herself and her girls, many of whom, including her niece Lucy, had come west to help her. She appealed successfully to Frances Willard to transfer the national WCTU convention to another state, for she was determined to keep the issue of prohibition out of the California campaign. With the press more than friendly, and several San Francisco dailies running women's suffrage departments, she realized the importance of keeping newspapers fed with readable, factual material, and enlisted the aid of a young journalist, Ida Husted Harper, whom she had met in 1878 while lecturing in Terre Haute, Indiana, and who was in California that winter. When the San Francisco Examiner, William Randolph Hearst's powerful Democratic paper, offered Susan a column on the editorial page if she would write it and sign it, she dictated her thoughts to Mrs. Harper, who smoothed them out for the column, helping her as Mrs. Stanton had in the past, for writing was still a great hardship. Grateful to Mrs. Harper, she sang her praises. The moment I give the idea, the point, she formulates it into a good sentence, while I should have to haggle over it half an hour. California women had won suffrage planks from Republicans, populists, and prohibitionists, and the prospects looked bright. Rich women came to their aid, Mrs. Leland Stanford with her railroad fortune, furnishing passes for all the speakers and organizers, and Mrs. Phoebe Hearst contributing $1,000 to their campaign. What warmed Susan's heart, however, was the spirit of the rank and file, the seamstresses and washerwomen, paying their $2 pledges and 25-cent installments, the poorly clad women bringing in 50 cents or $1 which they had saved by going without tea, and the women who had worked all day at their jobs, stopping at headquarters for a package of circulars to fold and address at night. The working women of California made it plain that they wanted to vote. Susan insisted upon carrying out what she called her wild goose chase over the state. People crowded to hear her at farmers' picnics in the mountains, in schoolhouses in small towns, and in pool rooms where chalked up on the blackboard she often found, "Welcome Susan B. Anthony." She was at home everywhere and ready for anything. The men liked her short, matter-of-fact speeches and her flashes of wit. Her hopes were high that the friendly people she met would not fail to vote justice to women. She grew apprehensive, however, when the newspapers, pressured by their advertisers, one by one began to ignore women's suffrage. The Liquor Dealers' League had been sending letters to hotel owners, grocers, and druggists, as well as to saloons, warning that votes for women would mean prohibition and would threaten their livelihood. Word was spread that if women voted, not one glass of beer would be sold in San Francisco. As in Kansas, liquor interests had persuaded naturalized Irish, Germans, and Swedes to oppose women's suffrage, so now in California they appealed to the Chinese. On Election Day, Susan was in San Francisco with Anna Howard Shaw and Ellen Sargent, watching and anxiously waiting for the returns. Telling the story of those last tense hours when women's fate hung in the balance, Anna Howard Shaw reported, "I shall always remember the picture of Miss Anthony and the wife of Senator Sargent wandering around the polls arm in arm at 11 o'clock at night, their tired faces taking on lines of deeper depression with every minute, for the count was against us. When the final counts came in, we found that we had won the state, from the north down to Oakland and from the south up to San Francisco. But there was not sufficient majority to overcome the adverse votes of San Francisco and Oakland. In San Francisco, the saloon element and the most aristocratic section made an equal showing against us. Every Chinese vote was against us. In spite of defeat in California, Susan had the joy of marking up 2 more states for women's suffrage in 1896. Utah was granted statehood with a women's suffrage provision in its constitution, and Idaho's favorable vote, though contested in the courts, was upheld by the state Supreme Court. Now women in Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah were voters. End of Chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Susan B. Anthony by Alma Lutz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24, Aunt Susan and Her Girls. The future of the National American Woman Suffrage Association was much on Susan's mind. This organization, which she had conceived and nursed through its struggling infancy, had grown in numbers and prestige, and she understood, as no one else could, the importance of leaving it in the right hands so that it could function successfully without her. The young women now in the work, many of them just out of college, were intelligent, efficient, and confident. And yet, as she compared them with the vivid, consecrated women active in the early days of the movement, she observed in her diary, Clarina Nichols, Paulina Davis, Lucy Stone, Frances D. Gage, Lucretia Mott, and E.C. Stanton, each without peer among any of our college graduates, young women of today. Even so, she appreciated the young women of today, whom she affectionately called her girls, or her adopted nieces, but she still held the reins tightly, although they often champed at the bit. Recognizing, however, that she must choose between personal power and progress for her cause, she characteristically chose progress. Quick to appreciate ability and zeal when she saw it, she seldom failed to make use of it. When Carrie Chapman Catt presented a detailed plan for a thorough overhauling of the mechanics of the organization, she gave her approval, remarking dryly, "There never yet was a young woman who did not feel that if she had had the management of the work from the beginning, the cause would have been carried long ago. I felt just that way when I was young." On 4 of her adopted nieces, Rachel Foster Avery, Anna Howard Shaw, Harriet Taylor Upton, and Carrie Chapman Catt, Susan felt that the greater part of her work would fall and be worthily done. Yet she feared that in her enthusiasm for efficient organization, they might lose the higher concepts of freedom and justice, which had been the driving force behind her work. Not having learned the lessons of leadership when the cause was unpopular, they lacked the discipline of adversity, which bred in the consecrated reformer the wisdom, tolerance, and vision so necessary for the success of her task. What they did understand far better than the highly individualistic pioneers was the value of teamwork, which grew in importance as the National American Association expanded far beyond the ability of one person to cope with it. Probably first in her affections was Rachel Foster Avery, who had been like a daughter to her since their trip to Europe together in 1883. The confidence she felt in their friendship was always a comfort. Rachel's intelligent approach to problems made her an asset at every meeting, and Susan relied much on her judgment. In Anna Howard Shaw, 10 years older than Rachel, Susan had found the hardy campaigner and orator for whom she had longed. Anna expressed a warmth and understanding that most of the younger women lacked, and best of all, she loved the cause as Susan herself loved it. Because of her close friendship with Susan's niece Lucy, she was regarded as one of the family, and whenever possible between lectures she stopped over in Rochester for a good talk with Aunt Susan. Harriet Taylor Upton of Warren, Ohio, had enlisted in the ranks in the 1880s, when her father was a member of Congress. Because of her influence in Washington and Ohio, Harriet was invaluable, and Susan speedily brought her into the official circle of the National American Association as treasurer, even thinking of her as a possible president. Harriet's jovial, irrepressible personality readily won friends, and Susan found her a refreshing and comfortable companion, able to see a bit of humor in almost every situation. When differences of opinion at meetings threatened to get out of hand, Harriet could always be relied on to break the tension with a few witty remarks. Carrie Chapman Catt gave every indication of developing into an outstanding executive. Not another one of Susan's girls could so quickly or so intelligently size up a situation as Carrie, nor could they so effectively put into action well-thought-out plans. Not as popular a speaker as the more emotional Anna Howard Shaw, she held her audiences by her appeal to their intelligence. Tall, handsome, and well-dressed, she never failed to leave a favorable impression. Only her name irked Susan, and as Susan wrote Clara Colby, "If Cat it must be, then I insist she should keep her own father's name, Lane, and not her first husband's name, Chapman." But the 3 C's intrigued Carrie, and she continued to be known as Carrie Chapman Catt. Now living in the East, because her husband's expanding business had brought him to New York, she was easily accessible, and from her beautiful new home at Bensonhurst, a suburb of Brooklyn, she carried on the rapidly growing work of the Organization Committee until a New York City office became imperative. In Carrie, Susan recognized qualities demanded of a leader at this stage of the campaign, when suffragists must learn to be as keen as politicians and as well organized. "Spring is not heralded in Washington by the arrival of the robin," commented a Washington newspaper, "but by the appearance of Miss Anthony's red shawl." Susan was still the dominating figure at the annual women's suffrage conventions. Everyone looked eagerly for the tall, lithe, gray-haired woman with a red shawl on her arm or around her shoulders. Once when Susan appeared on the platform with a new white crepe shawl, the reporters immediately registered their displeasure by putting down their pencils. This did not escape her, and always on good terms with the newsmen and informal with her audiences, she called out, "Boys, what is the matter?" "Where is the red shawl?" one of them asked. "No red shawl, no report." Enjoying this little byplay, she sent her niece Lucy back to the hotel for the red shawl, and when Lucy brought it up to the platform and put it about her shoulders, the audience burst into applause, for the red shawl, like Susan herself, had become the well-loved symbol of women's suffrage. Susan was convinced that the annual National Convention should always be held in Washington, where Congress could see and feel the growing strength and influence of the movement. Her girls, on the other hand, wanted to take their conventions to different parts of the country, to widen their influence. Not as certain as Susan that work for a federal amendment must come first, many of them contended that a few more states won for women's suffrage would best help the cause at this time. The Southern women, now active, were firm believers in states' rights and supported state work. Susan's experience had taught her the impracticability of direct appeal to the voters in the states, now that foreign-born men in increasing numbers were arrayed against votes for women. In spite of her arguments and her pleas, the National American Association voted in 1894 to hold conventions in different parts of the country in alternate years. Disappointed, but trying her best graciously to follow the will of the majority, she traveled to Atlanta and to Des Moines for the conventions of 1895 and 1897. Nor did the younger women welcome the messages which Mrs. Stanton, at Susan's insistence, sent to every convention. Susan herself often wished her good friend would stick more closely to women's suffrage instead of introducing extraneous subjects such as educated suffrage, the matriarchate, or woman and the church. But nevertheless, she proudly read her papers to successive conventions. Insisting that the conventions were too academic, Mrs. Stanton urged Susan to inject more vitality into them by broadening their platform. Susan, however, had come to the conclusion that concentration on women's suffrage was imperative in order to unite all women under one banner and build up numbers which congressmen were bound to respect. With this, her girls agreed 100%. While all of them were convinced suffragists, they were divided on other issues, and few of them were whole-hearted feminists, as were Susan and Mrs. Stanton. With the publication of the Woman's Bible in 1895, Mrs. Stanton almost upset the apple cart, stirring up heated controversy in the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The Woman's Bible was a keen and sometimes biting commentary on passages in the Bible relating to women. It questioned the traditional interpretation which for centuries has fastened the stigma of inferiority upon women, and pointed out that the female as well as the male was created in the image of God. To those who regarded every word of the Bible as inspired by God, the Woman's Bible was heresy, and both the clergy and the press stirred up a storm of protest against it. Suffragists were condemned for compiling a new Bible, and were obliged to explain again and again that the Woman's Bible expressed Mrs. Stanton's personal views and not those of the movement. Susan regarded the Woman's Bible as a futile, questionable digression from the straight path of women's suffrage. To Clara Colby, who praised it in her Woman's Tribune, she wrote, "Of all her great speeches, I am always proud, but of her Bible commentaries, I am not proud, either of their spirit or letter. I could cry a heap every time I read or think, if it would undo them, or do anybody or myself, or the cause or Mrs. Stanton any good. They are so entirely unlike her former self, so flippant and superficial. But she thinks I have gone over to the enemy, so counts my judgment worth nothing more than that of any narrow-souled body. But I shall love and honor her to the end, whether her Bible please me or not, so I hope she will do for me." She was, however, wholly unprepared for the rebellion staged by her girls at the Washington Convention of 1896, when, led by Rachel Foster Avery, they repudiated the Woman's Bible and proposed a resolution declaring that their organization had no connection with it. This was clear proof to Susan that her girls lacked tolerance and wisdom. Listening to the debate, she was heartsick. Anna Howard Shaw and Mrs. Catt, as well as Alice Stone Blackwell, spoke for the resolution. Only a few raised their voices against it, among them her sister Mary, Clara Colby, Mrs. Blake, and a young woman new to the ranks, Charlotte Perkins Stetson. Susan was presiding, and leaving the chair to express her opinions, she firmly declared, "To pass such a resolution, is to set back the hands on the dial of reform. We have all sorts of people in the association, and a Christian has no more right on our platform than an atheist. When this platform is too narrow for all to stand on, I shall not be on it. Who is to set up a line? Neither you nor I can tell Mrs. Stanton will come out triumphant and that this will be the great thing done in woman's cause. Lucretia Mott at first thought Mrs. Stanton had injured the cause of women's rights by insisting on the demand for women's suffrage, but she had sense enough not to pass a resolution about it. "Are you going to cater to the whims and prejudices of people?" she asked them. "We draw out from other people our own thought. If, when you go out to organize, you go with a broad spirit, you will create and call out breadth and toleration. You had better organize one woman on a broad platform than 10,000 on a narrow platform of intolerance and bigotry." Her voice tense with emotion, she concluded, "This resolution adopted will be a vote of censure upon a woman who is without a peer in intellectual and statesmanlike ability, one who has stood for half a century the acknowledged leader of progressive thought and demand in regard to all matters pertaining to the absolute freedom of women." When the resolution was adopted 53-40, she was so disappointed in her girls and so hurt by their defiance that she was tempted to resign. Hurrying to New York after the convention to talk with Mrs. Stanton, she found her highly indignant and insistent that they both resign from the ungrateful organization which had repudiated the woman to whom it owed its existence. The longer Susan considered taking this step, the less she felt able to make the break. She severely reprimanded Mrs. Catt, Rachel, Harriet Upton, and Anna, telling them they were setting up an inquisition. Finally, she wrote Mrs. Stanton, "No, my dear, instead of my resigning and leaving those half-fledged chickens without any mother, I think it my duty and the duty of yourself and all the liberals to be at the next convention and try to reverse this miserable narrow action." To a reporter who wanted her views on the Woman's Bible, she made it plain that she had no part in writing the book, but added, "I think women have just as good a right to interpret and twist the Bible to their own advantage as men have always twisted it and turned it to theirs. It was written by men, and therefore its reference to women reflects the light in which they were regarded in those days. In the same way, the history of our Revolutionary War was written, in which very little is said of the noble deeds of women, though we know how they stood by and helped the great work. It is so with history all through." For some years, Susan's girls had been urging her to write the reminiscences, spurred on by the fact that Mrs. Stanton, Mary Livermore, and Julia Ward Howe were writing theirs. There were also other good reasons for putting her to work at this task. Writing would keep her safely at home and away from the strenuous work in the field which they feared was sapping her strength. It would keep her well occupied so that they could develop the work and the conventions in their own way. Susan put off this task from month to month and from year to year, torn between her desire to leave a true record of her work and her longing to be always in the thick of the suffrage fight. Finally, she began looking about for a collaborator, convinced that she herself could never write an interesting line. Ida Husted Harper, with her newspaper experience and her interest in the cause, seemed the logical choice. And in the spring of 1897 she came to 17 Madison Street to work on the biography. The attic had been remodeled for workrooms, and here Susan now spent her days with Mrs. Harper, trying to reconstruct the past. She had definite ideas about how the book should be written, holding up as a model the biography of William Lloyd Garrison recently written by his children. Mrs. Harper always had high standards and, influenced by the formalities of the day, edited Susan's vivid, brusque letters, hurriedly written and punctuated with dashes so that they conformed with her own easy but more formal style. To this Susan readily consented, for she always appreciated her own writing ability. On one point, however, she was adamant, that her story be told without dwelling upon the disagreements among the old workers. The household was geared to the bog, as they call the biography. Mary, supervising as usual, watched over their meals and the housework with the aid of a young, rosy-cheeked Canadian girl, Anna Dan, who had recently come to work for them and whom they at once took to their hearts, making her one of the family. Soon another young girl, Genevieve Hawley, from Fort Scott, Kansas, was employed to help with the endless copying, sorting of letters, and pasting of scrapbooks, and with the current correspondence which piled up and diverted Susan from the book. Through 1897 and 1898, they worked at top speed. The Life and Work of Susan B. Anthony, a story of the evolution of the status of women, in 2 volumes by Ida Husted Harper, was published by the Bowen Merrill Company of Indianapolis just before Christmas, 1898. Happy as a young girl out of school, Susan inscribed copies for her many friends and eagerly watched for reviews, pleased with the favorable comments in newspapers and magazines throughout this country and Europe. By this time, the Cuban Rebellion was crowding all other news out of the papers, and Susan followed it closely, for this struggle for freedom instantly won her sympathy. She hoped that Spain, under pressure from the United States, might be persuaded to give Cuba her independence, but the blowing up of the battleship Maine and the war cries of the press and of a faction in Congress led to the armed intervention in April 1898. Always opposed to war as a means of settling disputes, she wrote Rachel, "To think of the mothers of this nation sitting back in silence without even the power of a legal protest, while their sons are taken without a by your leave. Well, all through, it is barbarous, and I hope you and all our young women will rouse to work as never before, and get the women of the Republic clothed with the power of control of conditions in peace, or when it shall come again, which heaven forbid, in war." Not only did she express these sentiments in letters to her friends, but in a public meeting, where only patriotic fervor and flag-waving were welcome, she dared criticize the unsanitary army camps and the greed and graft which deprived soldiers of wholesome food. "There isn't a mother in the land," she declared, "who wouldn't know that a shipload of typhoid-stricken soldiers would need cots to lie on and fuel to cook with, and that a swamp was not a desirable place in which to pitch a camp. What the government needs at such a time is not alone bacteriologists and army officers, but also women who know how to take care of sick boys and have the common sense to surround them with sanitary conditions." At this her audience, at first hostile, burst into applause. More and more disturbed by the inefficient care of the wounded and the feeding of enlisted men, she wrote Rachel, "Every day's reports and comments about the war only show the need of women at the front, not as employees permitted to be there because they begged to be, but there by right, as managers and dictators in all departments in which women have been trained, those of feeding and caring for in health and nursing the sick. The war over, the problem of governing the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Hawaii was of great interest to her, and she at once asked for the enfranchisement of the women of these newly won island possessions. She regarded it as an outrage for the most democratic nation in the world to foist upon them an exclusively masculine government, a male oligarchy, as she called it. "I really believe I shall explode," she wrote Clara Colby, "if some of you young women don't wake up and raise your voice in protest. I wonder if, when I am under the sod, or cremated and floating in the air, I shall have to stir you and others up. How can you not be all on fire?" The unwillingness of her girls to relate women's suffrage to contemporary public affairs such as this repeatedly disappointed her. Yet she was well aware that the younger generation would never see the work through her eyes or exactly follow her pattern. Disappointed that her National American Woman Suffrage Association did not attract members, as did the WCTU or the General Federation of Women's Clubs, she confessed to Clara Colby, "It is the disheartening part of my life that so very few women will work for the emancipation of their own half of the race." Watching women flock into these other organizations and contributing to all sorts of charities, she was obliged to admit that very few are capable of seeing that the cause of 9/10 of all the misfortunes which come to women, and to men also, lies in the subjection of women, and therefore the important thing is to lay the axe at the root. She also discovered that it was one thing to build up a large organization and another to keep women so busy with pressing work for the cause that they did not find time to expend their energies on the mechanics of organization. Not only did she chafe at the red tape most of them spun, but she often felt that they were too prone to linger in academic byways, listening to speeches and holding pleasant conventions. Since the California campaign of 1896, only one state, Washington, had been roused to vote on a women's suffrage amendment, which was defeated, and only one more state, Delaware, had granted women the right to vote for members of school boards. Again and again she warned her girls that some kind of action on women's suffrage by Congress every year was important. A hearing, a committee report, a debate, or even an unfavorable vote would, she was convinced, do more to stir up the whole nation than all the speakers and organizers that could be sent through the country. Such thoughts as these, relative to the work which was always on her mind, she dashed off to one after another of her young colleagues. "Your letters sound like a trumpet blast," wrote Anna Howard Shaw, grateful for her counsel. "They read like St. Paul's epistles to the Romans, so strong, so clear, so full of courage." At 78, Susan realized that the time was approaching when she must make up her mind to turn over to a younger woman the presidency of the National American Association. And in the summer of 1898, she announced to her executive committee that she would retire on her 80th birthday in 1900. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Susan B. Anthony by Alma Lutz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25, Passing on the Torch. The last year of Susan's presidency was particularly precious to her. In a sense, it represented her farewell to the work she had carried on most of her life, and at the same time it was also the hopeful beginning of the period leading to victory. Yet she had no illusion of speedy or easy success for her girls, and she did her best to prepare them for the obstacles they would inevitably meet. She warned them not to expect their cause to triumph merely because it was just. Governments, she told them, never do any great good things from mere principle, from mere love of justice. You expect too much of human nature when you expect that. The movement had reached an impasse. The temper of Congress, as shown by the admission of Hawaii as a territory without women's suffrage, was both indifferent and hostile. That this attitude did not express the will of the American people, she was firmly convinced. It was due, she believed, to the political influence of powerful groups opposed to women's suffrage. The liquor interests controlling the votes of increasing numbers of immigrants, machine politicians fearful of losing their power, and financial interests whose conservatism resisted any measure which might upset the status quo. How to undermine this opposition was now her main problem, and she saw no other way but persistent agitation through a more active, more effective, ever-growing women's suffrage organization, reaching a wider cross-section of the people. She herself had established a press bureau which was feeding interesting factual articles on women's suffrage to newspapers throughout the country. For as she wrote Mrs. Colby, the suffrage cause needs to picture its demands in the daily papers where the unconverted can see them rather than in special papers where only those already converted can see them. Of greatest importance to her was winning the support of organized labor. Samuel Gompers, the president of the American Federation of Labor, had already shown his friendliness toward equal pay and votes for women, and was putting women organizers in the field to speed the unionization of women. Even so, she was surprised at the enthusiasm with which she was received at the American Federation of Labor Convention in 1899, when the 400 delegates, by a rising vote, adopted a strong resolution urging favorable action on a federal women's suffrage amendment. So far as possible, she had always established friendly relations with labor organizations, first in 1869 with William H. Silvis's National Labor Union, and then with the Knights of Labor and their leader, Terence V. Powderly. When Eugene V. Debs, president of the American Railway Union, was arrested during the Pullman strike in 1894, for defying a court injunction, she did not rate him, as so many did, a dangerous radical, but as an earnest reformer, crusading for an unpopular cause. They had met years before in Terre Haute, where, at his request, she had lectured on women's suffrage, and immediately they had won each other's sympathy and respect. She did not see indications of anarchy in the Pullman and Homestead strikes, or in the Haymarket riot, but regarded them as an unfortunate phase of an industrial revolution which in time would improve the relations of labor and capital. That women would be affected by this industrial revolution was obvious to her, and she wanted them to understand it and play their part in it. For this reason, she saw the importance of keeping the National American Women's Suffrage Association informed on all developments affecting wage-earning women, and to her delight, she found 3 young suffragists wide awake on this subject. One of them, Florence Kelly, had joined forces with that remarkable young woman, Jane Addams, in her valuable social experiment, Hull House, in the slums of Chicago, and was now devoting herself to improving the working conditions of women and children. She represented a new trend in thought and work, social service, which made a great appeal to college women and set in motion labor legislation designed to protect women and children. Another young woman of promise, Gail Laughlin, pioneering as a lawyer, approached the subject from the feminist viewpoint, seeking protection for women not through labor legislation based on sex, but through trade unions, the vote, equal pay, and a wider recognition of women's right to contract for their labor on the same terms as men. Her survey of women's working conditions, presented at a convention of the National American Association, was so valuable and attracted so much attention that she was appointed to the United States Labor Commission. Harriet Stanton Blatch also understood the significance of the Industrial Revolution and women's part in it, and she too opposed labor legislation based on sex. Coming from England occasionally to visit her mother in New York, she brought her liberal viewpoint into women's suffrage conventions with a flair of oratory matching that of her gifted parents. "The more I see of her," Susan remarked to a friend, "the more I feel the greatness of her character." Although it was Susan's intention to hew to the line of women's suffrage and not to comment publicly on controversial issues, she could not keep silent when confronted with injustice. Religious intolerance, bigotry, and racial discrimination always forced her to take a stand, regardless of the criticism she might bring on herself. The treatment of the Negro in both the North and the South was always of great concern to her, and during the 1890s, when a veritable epidemic of lynchings and race riots broke out, she expressed herself freely in Rochester newspapers. She noted the dangerous trend as indicated by new anti-Negro societies and the limitation of membership to white Americans in the Spanish-American War Veterans Organization. Whenever the opportunity presented itself, she put into practice her own sincere belief in race equality. During every Washington convention, she arranged to have one of her good speakers occupy the pulpit of a Negro church, and in the South she made it a point to speak herself in Negro churches and schools and before their organizations, even though this might prejudice Southerners. In her own home, she gladly welcomed the Negro lecturers and educators who came to Rochester. This seeking out of the Negro in friendliness was a religious duty to her and a pleasure. She demanded of everyone employed in her household respectful treatment of Negro guests. She rejoiced when she saw Negroes in the audience at women's suffrage conventions in Washington, and it gave her great satisfaction to hear Mary Church Terrell, a beautiful, intelligent Negro who had been educated at Oberlin and in Europe, making speeches which equaled and even surpassed those of the most eloquent white suffragists. Susan did not fail to keep in touch with the international feminist movement, and in the summer of 1899, when she was 79 years old, she headed the United States delegation to the International Council of Women, meeting in London. Visiting Harriet Stanton Blatch at her home in Basingstoke, she first conferred with the leading British feminists, bringing herself up to date on the progress of their cause. In England, as in the United States, the burden of the suffrage campaign had shifted from the shoulders of the pioneers to their daughters, and they were carrying on with vigor, pressing for the passage of a franchise bill in the House of Commons. Moving on to London, she was acclaimed as she had been at the World's Fair in Chicago. "The papers here have been going wild over Miss Anthony, declaring her to be the most unaggressive woman suffragist ever seen," reported a journalist to his newspaper in the United States. From China, India, New Zealand, and Australia, from South Africa, Palestine, Persia, and the Argentine, as well as from Europe and the United States, women had come to London to discuss their progress and their problems, and Susan, pointing out to them the goal toward which they must head, declared with confidence, "The day will come when man will recognize women as his peer, not only at the fireside, but in the councils of the nation. Then, and not until then, will there be perfect comradeship between the sexes that shall result in the highest development of the race." She had hoped that Queen Victoria would receive the delegates at Windsor Castle, thus indicating her approval of the International Council. She longed to talk with this woman who had ruled so long and so well. That a queen sat on the throne of England, this in itself was important to her, and she wanted to express her gratitude, although she was well aware that the Queen had never used her influence for the improvement of laws relating to women. She had hoped to convince her of the need of votes for women, but Queen Victoria never gave her the opportunity. All that influential Englishwomen were able to arrange was the admission of the delegates to the courtyard of Windsor Castle to watch the Queen start on her drive and to tea in the banquet room without the Queen. Returning home late in August 1899, Susan began at once to make definite plans to turn over the presidency of the National American Women's Suffrage Association to a younger woman. Although she well knew that the choice of her successor was actually in the hands of the membership, it was her intention to do what she could within the bounds of democratic procedure to ensure the best possible leadership. To fill the office, she turned instinctively to Anna Howard Shaw, whom she loved more dearly as the years went by, and whose selfless devotion to the cause she trusted implicitly. Yet Anna, in spite of her many qualifications, lacked a few which were exceptional in Carrie Chapman Catt: creative executive ability, a diplomacy, a talent for working with people, directing them, and winning their devotion. With growing admiration, Susan had been watching Mrs. Catt's indefatigable work in the States, where she had been building up active branches. Her flair for raising money was outstanding, and Susan realized, as few others did, the crying need of funds for the campaigns ahead. In addition, Mrs. Catt had no personal financial worries, for her husband, successful in business, was sympathetic to her work. Anna, on the other hand, would have to support herself by lecturing and carry as well the burden of the presidency of a rapidly growing organization. Anna made the decision for Susan. She urged the candidacy of Mrs. Catt, although her highest ambition had always been to succeed her beloved Aunt Susan. As she later confessed to Susan, this was a personal sacrifice which cost her many a heartache, but she honestly felt that Mrs. Catt was better fitted, as well as freer to go into an unpaid field. Susan therefore approached Mrs. Catt through Rachel and Harriet Upton, and was relieved when she consented to stand for election. Rumors of Susan's retirement aroused ambitions in Lily Devereux Blake, who from the point of seniority and devoted work in New York was regarded as being next in line for the presidency by Mrs. Stanton and Mrs. Colby. Unable to visualize Mrs. Blake as the leader of this large organization with its diverse, strong personalities, Susan nevertheless conceded her right to compete for the office. Although she appreciated Mrs. Blake's valuable work for the cause, there never had been understanding or sympathy between them. Temperamentally, the blunt, stern New Englander, with untiring drive, had little in common with the Southern beauty turned reformer. A change in the presidency needed wise and patient handling, as personal ambitions, prejudices, and misunderstandings reared their heads. When there were murmurings of secession among a small group if Mrs. Catt were elected, Susan wrote Mrs. Colby that such talk was very immature, very despotic, very undemocratic, and she hoped she was not one of the malcontents. Another problem was the future of the organization committee, which under Mrs. Catt's chairmanship had carried on a large part of the work. Its influence was considerable and could readily develop so as to conflict with that of the officers, thus threatening the unity of the whole organization. To dissolve the committee seemed to Susan and her closest advisers the wisest procedure. Mary Garrett Hay, who had worked closely with Mrs. Catt on the organization committee, opposed this plan, but after earnest discussion the officers, including Mrs. Catt, agreed to dissolve the organization committee. As Susan appeared on the platform at the opening session of the Washington Convention in February 1900, there was thunderous applause from an audience tense with emotion at the thought of losing the leader who had guided them for so many years. The tall, gray-haired woman in black satin, with soft, rich lace at her throat, and the proverbial red shawl about her shoulders, had become the symbol of their cause. Now, as she looked down upon them with a friendly smile and motherly tenderness, tears came to their eyes, and they wanted to remember always just how she looked at that moment. Then she broke the tension with a call to duty, a summons to press for the federal amendment, and one more plea that they always hold their annual conventions in the national capital. Difficult and sad as this official leave-taking was, she had made up her mind to carry it through with good cheer. Tirelessly she presided at 3 sessions daily. With the pride of a mother, she listened to the many reports, and with particular satisfaction to that of the treasurer, which showed all debts paid and pledges amounting to $10,000 to start the new year. Susan herself had made this possible, raising enough to pay past debts and securing pledges so that the new administration could start its work free from financial worries. I have fully determined to retire from the active presidency of the association, she announced when the reports and speeches were over. I am not retiring now because I feel unable, mentally or physically, to do the necessary work, but because I wish to see the organization in the hands of those who are to have its management in the future. I want to see you all at work while I am alive, so I can scold you if you do not do it well. Give the matter of selecting your officers serious thought. Consider who will do the best work for the political enfranchisement of women, and let no personal feelings enter into the question. Watching developments with the keen eye of a politician, she was confident that Mrs. Catt would be elected to succeed her, although Mrs. Blake's candidacy was still being assiduously pressed, and circulars recommending her, signed by Mrs. Stanton, Mrs. Russell Sage, and Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby, were being widely distributed, Just before the balloting, however, Mrs. Blake withdrew her name in the interest of harmony. This left the field to Mrs. Catt, who received 254 votes of the 278 cast. A burst of applause greeted the announcement of Mrs. Catt's election. Then, abruptly it stopped, as the realization swept over the delegates that Aunt Susan was no longer their president. Walking to the front of the platform, Susan took Mrs. Catt by the hand, and while the delegates applauded, the two women stood before them, the one showing in her kind face the experience and wisdom of years, the other young, intelligent, and beautiful, her life still before her. There were tears in Susan's eyes, and her voice was unsteady as she said, "I am sure you have made a wise choice. New conditions bring new duties. These new duties, these changed conditions, demand stronger hands, younger heads, and fresher hearts. In Mrs. Catt, you have my ideal leader. I present to you my successor." Susan's joyous confidence in the new administration was rudely jolted as controversy over the future of the organization committee flared up during the last days of the convention. Under strong pressure from Mary Garrett Hay, Mrs. Catt had counseled with Henry Blackwell, and at one of the last sessions he had slipped in a motion authorizing the continuance of the organization committee. Stunned by this development, and looking upon it as a threat to the harmony of the new administration, Susan, supported by Harriet Upton and Rachel, prepared to take action, and the next morning, at the first post-convention executive committee meeting at which Mrs. Catt presided, Susan proposed that the national officers, headed by Mrs. Catt, take over the duties of the organization committee. This precipitated a heated debate, during which Henry Blackwell and his daughter Alice called such procedure unconstitutional, and Mary Hay resigned. As the discussion became too acrimonious, Mrs. Catt put an end to it by calling up unfinished business, and thus managed to steer the remainder of the session into less troubled waters. The next day, however, Susan brought the matter up again, and on her motion the organization committee was voted out of existence with praise for its admirable record of service. Here were all the makings of a factional feud which, if fanned into flame, could have well split the National American Association. Not only had the old organization interfered with the new, indirectly reprimanding Mrs. Catt, but Susan, by her own personal influence and determination, had reversed the action of the convention. As a result, Mrs. Catt was indignant, hurt, and sorely tempted to resign. But after sending a highly critical letter to every member of the business committee, she took up her work with vigor. Disappointed and heartsick over the turn of events, Susan searched for a way to re-establish harmony and her own faith in her successor. Realizing that a mother's cool counsel and guiding hand were needed to heal the misunderstandings, and convinced that unity and trust could be restored only by frank discussion of the problem by those involved, she asked for a meeting of the business committee at her home. "What can we do to get back into trust in each other?" she wrote Laura Clay. "That is the thing we must do, somehow, and it cannot be done by letter. We must hold a meeting, and we must have you and every single one of our members at it." Impatient at what to her seemed unnecessary delay, she kept prodding Mrs. Catt to call this meeting. Fortunately, both Susan and Mrs. Catt were genuinely fond of each other and placed the welfare of the cause above personal differences. Both were tolerant and steady, and understood the pressures put on the leader of a great organization. Anxious and troubled as she waited for this meeting, Susan appreciated Anna Shaw's visits as never before, marking them as red-letter days on her calendar. Late in August 1900, all the officers finally gathered at 17 Madison Street, and Susan listened to their discussions with deep concern. She was confident she could rely completely upon Harriet Upton, Rachel, and Anna, and could count on Laura Clay's level head and good common sense. She never felt sure of Alice Stone Blackwell, and knew there was great sympathy and often a working alliance between her father, and Mrs. Catt. Of the latest member of the official family, Catherine Waugh McCullough, she had little first-hand knowledge. Mrs. Catt, whom she longed to fathom and trust, was still an enigma. During those hot, humid August days, misunderstandings were healed, unity was restored, and Susan was reassured that not a single one of her girls desired other than was good for the work. Susan had always been a champion of coeducation, speaking for it as early as the 1850s at state teachers' meetings and proposing it for Columbia University in her Revolution. In 1891, she and Mrs. Stanton had agitated for the admission of women to the University of Rochester. 7 years later, the trustees consented to admit women provided $100,000 could be raised in a year, and Susan served on the fundraising committee with her friend Helen Barrett Montgomery. Because the alumni of the University of Rochester opposed coeducation, and the city's wealthiest men were indifferent, progress was slow. But the trustees were persuaded to extend the time and to reduce by 1/2 the amount to be raised. With so much else on her mind in 1900, including the sudden death of her brother Merritt, she had given the fund little thought until the committee appealed to her in desperation when only 1 day remained in which to raise the last $8,000. Immediately she went into action. Remembering that Mary had talked of willing the university $2,000 if it became coeducational, she persuaded her to pledge that amount now. Then, setting out in a carriage on a very hot September morning, she slowly collected pledges for all but $2,000. As the trustees were in session and likely to adjourn any minute, she appealed to Samuel Wilder, one of Rochester's prominent elder citizens who had already contributed, to guarantee that amount until she could raise it. To this he gladly agreed. Reaching the trustees' meeting with Mrs. Montgomery just in time, with pledges assuring the payment of the full $50,000, she was amazed at their reception. Instead of rejoicing with them, the trustees began to quibble over Samuel Wilder's guarantee of the last $2,000 because of the state of his health. When she offered her life insurance as security, they still put her off, telling her to come back in a few days. Even then, they continued to quibble, but finally admitted that the woman had won. Disillusioned, she wrote in her diary, "Not a trustee has given anything, although there are several millionaires among them." Only her life insurance policy and her dogged persistence had saved the day. This effort to open Rochester University to women, on top of a very full and worrisome year, was so taxing and so disillusioning that she became seriously ill. When she recovered sufficiently for a drive, she asked to be taken to the university campus, and afterward wrote in her diary, "As I drove over the campus, I felt these are not forbidden grounds to the girls of the city any longer. It is good to feel that the old doors sway on their hinges to women." Will the vows be kept to them? Will the girls have equal chances with the boys? They promised well. The fulfillment will be seen. Whether there shall not be some hitch from the proposed to a separate school. Still keeping her watchful eye on the National American Association, Susan traveled to Minneapolis in the spring of 1901 for the first annual convention under the new administration. There was talk of an entire New Deal, the retirement of all who had served under Miss Anthony, and the election of a new cabinet of officers. And Susan was so concerned that there might also be a change in the presidency that she felt she must be on hand to guide and steady the proceedings. Mrs. Catt was re-elected, and Susan returned to Rochester well satisfied and ready to devote herself to completing the 4th volume of the History of Women's Suffrage, on which she and Mrs. Harper had been working intermittently for the past year. It was published late in 1902. While working on the history, Susan, although more than satisfied with Mrs. Harper's work, often thought nostalgically of her happy, stimulating years of collaboration with Mrs. Stanton. She seldom saw Mrs. Stanton now, but they kept in touch with each other by letter. In the spring of 1902, she visited Mrs. Stanton twice in New York, and planned to return in November to celebrate Mrs. Stanton's 87th birthday. In anticipation, she wrote Mrs. Stanton, "It is 51 years since we first met, and we have been busy through every one of them, stirring up the world to recognize the rights of women. We little dreamed when we began this contest that half a century later we would be compelled to leave the finish of the battle to another generation of women. But our hearts are filled with joy to know that they enter upon this task equipped with a college education, with business experience, with the freely admitted right to speak in public, all of which were denied to women 50 years ago. These strong, courageous, capable young women will take our place and complete our work. There is an army of them where we were but a handful." 2 weeks before Mrs. Stanton's birthday, Susan was stunned by a telegram announcing that her old comrade had passed away in her chair. Bewildered and desolate, she sat alone in her study for several hours, trying bravely to endure her grief. Then came the reporters for copy, which only this heartbroken woman could give. "I cannot express myself at all as I feel," she haltingly told them. "I'm too crushed to speak. If I had died first, she would have found beautiful phrases to describe our friendship, but I cannot put it into words." From New York, where she had gone for the funeral, she wrote in anguish to Mrs. Harper, "Oh, the voice is stilled, which I loved to hear for 50 years. Always I have felt that I must have Mrs. Stanton's opinion of things before I knew where I stood myself. I am all at sea, but the laws of nature are still going on, with no shadow or turning. What a wonder it is! It goes right on and on, no matter who lives or who dies." National women's suffrage conventions were still red-letter events to Susan, and she attended them no matter how great the physical effort, traveling to New Orleans in 1903. Of particular concern was the 1904 convention because of Mrs. Catt's decision at the very last moment not to stand for re-election on account of her health. Looking over the field, Susan saw no one capable of taking her place but Anna Howard Shaw. Not to be able to turn to Mrs. Stanton's capable daughter, Harriet Stanton Blatch, at this time was disappointing. But Harriet's long absence in England had made her more or less of a stranger to the membership of the National American Association, and for some reason she did not seem to fit in, lacking her mother's warmth and appeal. I don't see anybody in the whole rank of our suffrage movement to take her, Mrs. Catt's, place but you, Susan now wrote Anna Howard Shaw. If you will take it with a salary of, say, $2,000, I will go ahead and try to see what I can do. We must not let the society down into feeble hands. Don't say no, for the life of you. For if Mrs. Catt persists in going out, we shall simply have to accept it, and we must tide over with the best material that we have, and you are the best. And would you have taken office 4 years ago, you would have been elected overwhelmingly. Anna could not refuse Aunt Susan, and when she was elected with Mrs. Catt as vice president, Susan breathed freely again. It warmed Susan's heart to enter the convention on her 84th birthday to a thundering welcome, to banter with Mrs. Upton, who called her to the platform, and to stop the applause with a smile and, "There now, girls, that's enough." Nothing could have been more appropriate for her birthday than the Colorado Jubilee over which she presided and which gave irrefutable evidence of the success of women's suffrage in that state. There was rejoicing, too, over Australia, where women had been voting since 1902, and over the new hope in Europe in Denmark, where women had chosen her birthday to stage a demonstration in favor of the pending franchise bill. For the last time, she spoke to a Senate committee on the women's suffrage amendment. Standing before these indifferent men, a tired warrior at the end of a long, hard campaign, she reminded them that she alone remained of those who 35 years before, in 1869, had appealed to Congress for justice. And I, she added, shall not be able to come much longer. We have waited, she told them. We stood aside for the Negro. We waited for the millions of immigrants. Now we must wait till the Hawaiians, the Filipinos, and the Puerto Ricans are enfranchised. Then, no doubt, the Cubans will have their turn. For all these ignorant alien peoples, educated women have been compelled to stand aside and wait. Then, with mounting impatience, she asked them, how long will this injustice, this outrage, continue? Their answer to her was silence. They sent no report to the Senate on the women's suffrage amendment, yet she was able to say to a reporter of the New York Sun, I have never lost my faith, not for a moment in 50 years. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Susan B. Anthony by Alma Lutz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Susan B. Anthony of the World. Susan was on the ocean in May 1904 with her sister Mary and a group of good friends, headed for a meeting of the International Council of Women in Berlin. What drew her to Berlin was the plan initiated by Carrie Chapman Catt to form an international women's suffrage alliance prior to the meetings of the International Council. This had been Susan's dream and Mrs. Stanton's in 1883, when they first conferred with women of other countries regarding an international women's suffrage organization, and found only the women of England ready to unite on such a radical program. Now that women had worked together successfully in the International Council for 16 years on other less controversial matters relating to women, she and Mrs. Catt were confident that a few of them at least were willing to unite to demand the vote. Chosen as a matter of course to preside over this gathering of suffragists in Berlin, Susan received an enthusiastic welcome. For her, it was a momentous occasion. and eager to spread news of the meeting far and wide, she could not understand the objections of many of the delegates to the presence of reporters who they feared might send out sensational copy. "My friends, what are we here for?" she asked her more timid colleagues. "We have come from many countries, traveled thousands of miles to form an organization for a great international work. And do we want to keep it a secret from the public? No. Welcome all reporters who want to come. The more the better. Let all we say and do here be told far and wide. Let the people everywhere know that in Berlin, women from all parts of the world have banded themselves together to demand political freedom. I rejoice in the presence of these reporters, and instead of excluding them from our meetings, let us help them to all the information we can and ask them to give it the widest publicity." This won the battle for the reporters, who gave her rousing applause, and the news flashed over the wires was sympathetic, dignified, and abundant. It told the world of the formation of the International Women's Suffrage Alliance by women from the United States, Great Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Australia, Norway, and Denmark, to secure the enfranchisement of women of all nations. It praised the honorary president, Susan B. Anthony, and the American women who took over the leadership of this international venture, Carrie Chapman Catt, the president, and Rachel Foster Avery, corresponding secretary. To celebrate the occasion, German suffragists called a public mass meeting, and Susan, eager to rejoice with them, was surprised to find members of the International Council disgruntled and accusing the International Women's Suffrage Alliance of stealing their thunder and casting the dark shadow of women's suffrage over their conference. To placate them and restore harmony, she stayed away from this public meeting, but she could not control the demand for her presence. "Where is Susan B. Anthony?" were the first words spoken as the mass meeting opened. Then immediately the audience rose and burst into cheers, which continued without a break for 10 minutes. Anna Howard Shaw, there on the platform, and deeply moved by this tribute to Aunt Susan, later described how she felt. "Every second of that time I seemed to see Miss Anthony alone in her hotel room, longing with all her big heart to be with us, as we longed to have her. Afterwards, when we burst in upon her and told her of the great demonstration the mere mention of her name had caused, her lips quivered and her brave old eyes filled with tears. The next morning her girls brought her the Berlin newspapers, translating for her the report of the meeting and these heartwarming lines, 'The Americans call her Aunt Susan. She is our Aunt Susan too.' This was but a foretaste of her reception throughout her stay in Berlin. To the International Council, she was Susan B. Anthony of the world, the woman of the hour, whom all wanted to meet. Every time she entered the conference hall, the audience rose and remained standing until she was seated. Every mention of her name brought forth cheers. The many young women, acting as ushers, were devoted to her and eager to serve her. They greeted her by kissing her hand. Embarrassed at first by such homage, she soon responded by kissing them on the cheek. The Empress Victoria Augusta, receiving the delegates in the royal palace, singled out Susan, and instead of following the custom of kissing the Empress's hand, Susan bowed as she would to any distinguished American, explaining that she was a Quaker and did not understand the etiquette of the court. The Empress praised Susan's great work, and unwilling to let such an opportunity slip by, Susan offered the suggestion that Emperor William, who had done so much to build up his country, might now wish to raise the status of German women. To this the Empress replied with a smile, "The gentlemen are very slow to comprehend this great movement." When the talented Negro, Mary Church Terrell, addressing the International Council in both German and French, received an ovation, Susan's cup of joy was filled to the brim, for she glimpsed the bright promise of a world without barriers of sex or race. The newspapers welcomed her home, and in her own comfortable sitting room she read Rochester's greeting in the Democrat and Chronicle. There are women suffragists and anti-suffragists, but all Rochester people, irrespective of opinion, are Anthony men and women. We admire and esteem one so single-minded, earnest, and unselfish, who with 84 years to her credit is still too busy and useful to think of growing old. Her happiness over this welcome was clouded, however, by the serious illness of her brother Daniel, and she and Mary hurried to Kansas to see him. 2 months later, he passed away. Now, only she and Mary were left of the large Anthony family. Without Daniel, the world seemed empty. His strength of character, independence, and sympathy with her work had comforted and encouraged her all through her life. A fearless editor, a successful businessman, a politician with principles, he had played an important role in Kansas, and proud of him, she cherished the many tributes published throughout the country. Courageously, she now picked up the threads of her life. Her precious National American Woman Suffrage Association was out of her hands, but she still had the history of women's suffrage to distribute, and it gave her a great sense of accomplishment to hand on to future generations this record of women's struggle for freedom. Missing the stimulus of work with her girls, she took more and more pleasure in the company of William and Mary Gannett of the First Unitarian Church, whose liberal views appealed to her strongly. She liked to have young people about her, and followed the lives of all her nieces and nephews with the greatest interest, spurring on their ambitions and helping finance their education. The frequent visits of niece Lucy were a great joy during these years, as was the nearness of niece Anna O., who married and settled in Rochester. The young Canadian girl, Anna Dan, had become almost indispensable to her and to Mary, as companion, secretary, and nurse, and her marriage left a void in the household. Anna Dan was married at 17 Madison Street by Anna Howard Shaw, with Susan beaming upon her like a proud grandmother. Longing to see one more state won for suffrage, Susan carefully followed the news from the field, looking hopefully to California and urging her girls to keep hammering away there in spite of defeats. Her eyes were also on the territory of Oklahoma, where a constitution was being drafted preparatory to statehood. "The present bill for the new state," she wrote Anna Howard Shaw in December 1904, "is an insult to women of Oklahoma, such as has never been perpetrated before. We have always known that women were in reality ranked with idiots and criminals, but it has never been said in words that the state should restrict or abridge the suffrage on account of illiteracy, minority, sex, conviction of felony, mental condition, etc. We must fight this bill to the utmost." The brightest spot in the West was Oregon, where suffrage had been defeated in 1900 by only 2,000 votes. In June 1905, when the National American Association held its first Far Western Convention in Portland during the Lewis and Clark Exposition, Susan could not keep away, although she had never expected to go over the mountains again. As she traveled to Portland with Mary and 100 or more delegates in special cars, she recalled her many long, tiring trips through the West to carry the message of women's suffrage to the frontier. In comparison, this was a triumphal journey, showing her, as nothing else could, what her work had accomplished. Greeted at railroad stations along the way by enthusiastic crowds, showered with flowers and gifts, she stood on the back platform of the train with her girls, shaking hands, waving her handkerchief, and making an occasional speech. Presiding over the opening session of the Portland Convention, standing in a veritable garden of flowers which had been presented to her, she remarked with a droll smile, "This is rather different from the receptions I used to get 50 years ago. I am thankful for this change of spirit which has come over the American people." On Women's Day, she was chosen to speak at the unveiling of the statue of Sacagawea, the Indian woman who had led Lewis and Clark through the dangerous mountain passages to the Pacific, winning their gratitude and their praise. In the story of Sacagawea, who had been overlooked by the government when every man in the Lewis and Clark expedition had been rewarded with a large tract of land, Susan saw the perfect example of man's thoughtless oversight of the valuable services of women. Looking up at the bronze statue of the Indian woman, her papoose on her back, and her arm outstretched to the Pacific, Susan said simply, "This is the first statue erected to a woman because of deeds of daring. This recognition of the assistance rendered by a woman in the discovery of this great section of the country is but the beginning of what is due." Then, with the sunlight playing on her hair and lighting up her face, she appealed to the men of Oregon for the vote. "Next year," she reminded them, "the men of this proud state, made possible by a woman, will decide whether women shall at last have the rights in it which have been denied them so many years. Let men remember the part women have played in its settlement and progress, and vote to give them these rights which belong to every citizen." Reporters were at Susan's door when she returned to Rochester for comments on the ex-President Cleveland's tirade against club women and women's suffrage in the popular Ladies' Home Journal. "Pure folderol," she told them, adding testily, "I would think that Grover Cleveland was about the last person to talk about the sanctity of the home and woman's sphere." This was good copy for Republican newspapers, and they made the most of it, as women throughout the country added their protest to Susan's. A popular jingle of the day ran, "Susan B. Anthony. She took quite a fall out of Grover C." Susan, however, had something far more important on her mind than fencing with Grover Cleveland, an interview with President Theodore Roosevelt. Here was a man eager to right wrongs, to break monopolies, to see justice done to the Negro, a man who talked of a square deal for all, and yet women's suffrage aroused no response in him. In November 1905, she undertook a trip to Washington for the express purpose of talking with him. The year before, at a White House reception, he had singled her out to stand at his side in the receiving line. She looked for the same friendliness now. Memorandum in hand, she plied him with questions which he carefully evaded, but she would not give up. "Mr. Roosevelt," she earnestly pleaded, "this is my principal request. It is almost the last request I shall ever make of anybody. Before you leave the presidential chair, recommend to Congress to submit to the legislatures a constitutional amendment which will enfranchise women and thus take your place in history with Lincoln, the great emancipator. I beg of you not to close your term of office without doing this." To this he made no response, and trying once more to wring from him some slight indication of sympathy for her cause, she added, "Mr. President, your influence is so great that just one word from you in favor of women's suffrage would give our cause a tremendous impetus." "The public knows my attitude," he tersely replied. "I recommended it when governor of New York." "True," she acknowledged, "but that was a long time ago. Our enemies say that this was the opinion of your younger years, and that since you have been president, you have never uttered one word that could be construed as an endorsement." "They have no cause to think I have changed my mind," he suavely replied as he bade her goodbye. In the months that followed, he gave her no sign that her interview had made the slightest impression. One of the most satisfying honors bestowed on Susan during these last years was the invitation to be present at Bryn Mawr College in 1902 for the unveiling of a bronze portrait medallion of herself. Bryn Mawr, under its brilliant young president, M. Carey Thomas, herself a pioneer and establishing the highest standards for women's education, showed no such timidity as Vassar, where neither Susan nor Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been welcome as speakers. At Bryn Mawr, Susan talked freely and frankly with the students, and best of all, became better acquainted with M. Carey Thomas and her enterprising friend, Mary Garrett of Baltimore, who was using her great wealth for the advancement of women. She longed to channel their abilities to women's suffrage, and a few years later arranged for a national convention in their home city, Baltimore, appealing to them to make it an outstanding success. Arriving in Baltimore in January 1906 for this convention, Susan was the honored guest in Mary Garrett's luxurious home. Frail and ill, she was unable to attend all the sessions, as in the past, but she was present at the highlight of this very successful convention, the college evening arranged by M. Carey Thomas. With women's colleges still resisting the discussion of women's suffrage, and the Association of Collegiate Alumni refusing to support it, the college evening marked the first public endorsement of this controversial subject by college women. Up to this time, the only encouraging sign had been the formation in 1900 of the College Equal Suffrage League by two young Radcliffe alumni, Maud Wood Park and Inez Haynes Irwin. Now here, in conservative Baltimore, college presidents and college faculty gave women's suffrage their blessing, and Susan listened happily as distinguished women, one after another, allied themselves to the cause. Dr. Mary E. Woolley, who was president of Mount Holyoke, was developing Mary Lyons Pioneer Seminary into a high-ranking college. Lucy Salmon, Mary A. Jordan, and Mary W. Calkins of the faculties of Vassar, Smith, and Wellesley. Eva Perry Moore, a trustee of Vassar and president of the Association of Collegiate Alumni, with whom she dared differ on this subject. Maud Wood Park, representing the younger generation in the College Equal Suffrage League. And last of all, the president of Bryn Mawr, M. Carey Thomas. After expressing her gratitude to the pioneers of this great movement, Miss Thomas turned to Susan and said, "To you, Miss Anthony, belongs by right as to no other woman in the world's history, the love and gratitude of all women in every country of the civilized globe. We, your daughters in spirit, rise up today and call you blessed. Of such as you were the lines of the poet Yeats written. They shall be remembered forever. They shall be alive forever. They shall be speaking forever. The people shall hear them forever. During the thunderous applause, Susan came forward to respond, her face alight, and the audience rose. If any proof were needed of the progress of the cause for which I have worked, it is here tonight, she said simply. The presence on the stage of these college women, and in the audience of all those college girls who will someday be the nation's greatest strength, tell their story to the world. They give the highest joy and encouragement to me. During her visit at the home of Mary Garrett, Susan spoke freely with her and with M. Carey Thomas of the needs of the National American Association, particularly of the standing fund of $100,000 of which she had dreamed and which she had started to raise. Now, like an answer to prayer, Mary Garrett and President Thomas, fresh from their successful money-raising campaigns for Johns Hopkins and Bryn Mawr, offered to undertake a similar project for women's suffrage, proposing to raise $60,000, $12,000 a year for the next 5 years. As we sat at her feet day after day between sessions of the convention, listening to what she wanted us to do to help women and asking her questions, recalled M. Carey Thomas in her later years, I realized that she was the greatest person I had ever met. She seemed to me everything that a human being could be, a leader to die for or to live for, and follow wherever she led. Immediately after the convention, Susan went to Washington with the women who were scheduled to speak at the congressional hearing on women's suffrage. In her room at the Shoreham Hotel, a room with a view of the Washington Monument, which the manager always saved for her, she stood at the window looking out over the city as if saying farewell. Then, turning to Anna Shaw, she said with emotion, I think it is the most beautiful monument in the whole world. That evening she sat quietly through the many tributes offered to her on her 86th birthday, longing to tell all her friends the gratitude and hope that welled up in her heart. Finally she rose, and standing by Anna Howard Shaw, who was presiding, she impulsively put her hand on her shoulder and praised her for her loyal support. Then turning to the other officers, she thanked them for all they had done. There are others also, she added, just as true and devoted to the cause. I wish I could name everyone, but with such women consecrating their lives. She hesitated a moment, and then, in her clear, rich voice, added with emphasis, failure is impossible. In Rochester, in the home she so dearly loved, she spent her last weeks thinking of the cause and the women who would carry it on. Longing to talk with Anna Shaw, she sent for her, but Anna, feeling she was needed, came even before a letter could reach her. With Anna at her bedside, Susan was content. I want you to give me a promise, she pleaded, reaching for Anna's hand. Promise me you will keep the presidency of the association as long as you are well enough to do the work. Deeply moved, Anna replied, But how can I promise that? I can keep it only as long as others wish me to keep it. Promise to make them wish you to keep it, Susan urged, just as I wish you to keep it. After a moment she continued, I do not know anything about what comes to us after this life ends. But if I have any conscious knowledge of this world and of what you are doing, I shall not be far away from you. And in times of need, I will help you all I can. Who knows? Perhaps I may be able to do more for the cause after I am gone than while I'm here. A few days later, on March 13th, 1906, she passed away, her hand in Anna's. Asked a few years before if she believed that all women in the United States would ever be given the vote, she had replied with assurance, "It will come, but I shall not see it. It is inevitable. We could no more deny forever the right of self-government to 1/2 our people than we could keep the Negro forever in bondage. It will not be wrought by the same disrupting forces that freed the slave, but come it will, and I believe within a generation." She had so longed to see women voting throughout the United States, to see them elected to legislatures and Congress. But for her, there had only been the promise of fulfillment in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, and far away in New Zealand and Australia. "Failure is impossible" was the rallying cry she left with her girls to spur them on in the long, discouraging struggle ahead. 14 more years of campaigning until on August 26, 1920, women were enfranchised throughout the United States by the 19th Amendment. Even then their work was not finished, for she had looked farther ahead to the time when men and women everywhere, regardless of race, religion, or sex, would enjoy equal rights. Her challenging words, "Failure is impossible," still echo and re-echo through the years, as the crusade for human rights goes forward and men and women together strive to build and preserve a free world. End of Chapter 26. Recording by Phyllis Vincelli. End of Susan B. Anthony, Rebel, Crusader, Humanitarian by Alma Lutz.